So, how do you write a book? How do you create a book? There are 4 phases to creating a book, and that is what I would like to give an overview of today in this particular video. If you're thinking about writing a book, if that's on your bucket list, you should know these 4 phases and work towards mastering these 4 phases in your process to be able to bring about your final goal, your final product. Have that book in your hands, or probably more importantly, have your book in front of readers who want to read that type of book. If you're kind of involved in writing a book already, if you've already started your book, it's really important to still know phase 3 and phase 4 here. And if you've written books before, being able to acknowledge these phases can, I think, still be helpful. So the four phases are: number 1, planning; number 2, writing your initial draft, so writing the book; number 3, revision, revising the book; number 4, publishing the book. And yes, revision and publication are phases of creating the book. You need to be able to get your book out in front of somebody and get it out in the world. Because if nobody's reading it, it's a bit like a tree falling in the forest. If no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Like, what's the sound of one hand clapping? So it's important. It's important to think about publication. You can think about publication way back in that first phase, which is planning. First phase, planning, is, in my opinion, the most important phase. And if you plan well, then the rest of the phases will be easy. In fact, for me, all of my major failures and hangups that I've had writing books has been a result of me failing to properly plan the book in advance, to do all the planning phase correctly, or to shortcut it and just jump straight into prose and that sort of stuff. So here's what could be included in your planning phase, or should be included in your planning phase, is decisions about what story you're going to write. What genre is it going to be in? If it's going to be in a genre, in a set genre, which it probably should be. What genre is it going to be in? What the setting is going to look like. If you're writing fantasy or science fiction, world building will be part of that setting decision. And indeed, you can spend a lot of time on world building. You should be able to decide during that planning phase what your characters are going to look like, and who's going to be who's going to be living in this setting, and who's going to be executing the plot. Also in planning should be all of your research that you're doing for your book. So if you're writing a historical fiction novel, and indeed I have written historical fiction, you can actually pick it up on Amazon. It's called Muramasa Blood Drinker, and links will be down below. Find it off of deviouspress.com. I did a lot of research for that, and that helped the book be created quite easily. So research should be in that planning phase. Also, what should be in that planning phase is a decision about how you're actually going to go about writing the book, like how many words you're going to try for per day, when you'd like to complete the project. Also, you should include perhaps like some market research if you want to go that route. A lot of people as writers don't want to do market research prior to writing a book. They want it to be a self-expression, and I get that because that's what I prefer to do. But if you want to do market research and sort of see what kind of book people might like, that's going to be in the planning phase as well. And that's going to inform all those decisions. And lastly, I think the planning phase should include a thorough understanding of what kind of story it is from the plot perspective. What events are going to happen to bring about what you want, like what the final plot goal is, and then what's going to happen to bring you there. There's different amounts of detail you can go into when you're plotting out before you begin writing. I tend to kind of be somewhere in the middle. There's like Gardner writers who completely skip the planning phase and just begin writing words to see what happens. There's like architect writers that plot everything out. I tend to be an architect, but I don't plot quite as detailed as some other people that I know. Some people are like scene 1, scene 2. They're really, really detailed about what's going to happen. I tend to look at the big events and sort of the general idea of what's going to happen in what sequence, and then as I'm writing, I like to feel the pace out and kind of feel what order I want events to go in order to achieve each of those little goals. It's a little bit more organic to me, and I like it because then I have a very much tighter control over the way the book feels and is paced on a moment-to-moment basis. So that works well for me. But you have to find your own preference within that, so you have to design your own process. Now, if you do a good job in planning, phase 2, the execution part, the part where you actually write your book, is pretty easy to accomplish. If you've written out a bunch of plot points, all you have to do is just write stuff until you've covered all the plot points. That's your rough draft. If you haven't written out your plot points, you're going to probably get stuck at some point. In phase 2, that writing of the initial draft, That's where most writers I know who get stuck, they get stuck. And they tend to get stuck because they don't know what happens next. They get writer's block. Writer's block happens because you haven't planned well enough in advance. Before I begin a book, I have an idea of the entire plot, like what's going to happen in the book to bring about what I want to happen. And then I'm just able to execute it. And to the degree that I've properly planned the plot, the drafting is easy. And if I get to a point in a draft where I realize I don't quite like where I'm going, or I don't quite know what's happening next, I know it's because I have failed in the planning phase. Indeed, my failures are results of me failing in the planning phase, and I tend to fail on that initial draft. So if you find yourself stuck with writer's block, go back to the planning phase, figure out where the story needs to go and how you're going to get there, and write it down, and then you can begin executing again. That'll kind of help you get over that writer's block and finish that second draft. Now, first draft, once you get through the end of phase 2, which is your first draft, you are permitted to celebrate and feel proud, because that's a major accomplishment, especially if you've written a full-length novel. That's a lot of work. However, your work is not complete. Luckily, the next 2 phases tend to be a little bit more straightforward than getting through your initial draft. Revision involves a bunch of different things. So phase 3 revision can involve hiring an editor to help you clean up your manuscript, or to just edit it themselves. I don't necessarily think you should start with an outside editor, though. I think you should start with yourself, because yourself is still going to have a really good idea of what the story is supposed to be, but it's good to have outside perspectives as well. If you have beta readers that can read stuff for you and give you feedback, that's really, really useful. But revision does not involve just like checking for spelling mistakes, which a lot of people think that proofreading is what the revision that's what editing is. No, it's figuring out what works and doesn't work in the story, figuring out what scene is superfluous, what dialogue is bad, what prose needs to be rewritten, what's clear and what's not clear. All of that's part of editing. When you go through and you edit a book and you revise a book, there may be a scene that you just cut out because you figure out it's unnecessary. There may be a scene that isn't working. You need to rewrite it in a different way to make it work, or in a different location or something like that. You may find that characters are coming off the way that in a different way from how you wanted them to come off, and you need to rewrite their dialogue and some of their scenes in order to fix it. So the revision phase is going to include rewrites. It's going to include deletions. It's going to include just general fixing of mistakes and errors to hopefully get your manuscript ready for that 4th phase, which is publication. Now, before I go on, lots of people spend different amounts of time in these. I mentioned that there's like pants writers who don't spend any time planning. They just begin writing. Well, if you manage to get through a novel just writing it, you may get to phase 3 and figure out the revision's really hard, because there's things that are part of that pants writing process that you can't just like cut out and replace very easily, because it's all been kind of like through composed. So it's a lot harder to edit in that 3rd phase to make it a good manuscript sometimes. Okay, some people tend to write their rough draft really rough, like it's just something that's basically dialogue and very little prose, and then they rewrite it in order to get it into like a good format for their book. So it just depends on what you like your process to be. I've talked to authors who do it both ways. There's one that tends to drop by the channel every so often, and he tends to spend more time on revisions and rewriting stuff than doing the initial draft. Now, I like to plan well so that when I get to this revision phase, there's almost nothing for me to do. I don't like doing a ton of editing or a ton of revision. I always do some, because there's some things that you figure out, I'm not convinced by this doesn't work. I need to revise it, need to rewrite it. But if you've planned well, then I find that 3rd phase, the editing phase, there's just a whole lot less to do in order to polish off a manuscript. 4th phase, publication may involve more editing. So depending on what route you go. And I'll briefly describe the two main ways that you're going to go when it's time to publish your book. There's either the traditional route, or there's the non-traditional route, the independent route. And even within the independent route, there's different ways to do it. There's a multitude of ways. So if you want to go traditional publish route, which is, you're going to have maybe like one of the big 5 publishers print your book and get it in stores and sell the ebook and do all that kind of stuff for you. And then a lot of people are attracted, I think, to traditional publishing because they have this idea that they just won't have to do any work, that they can just focus on writing. And that's not really the case in 2017. You're probably still going to have to do a lot of self-promotion and actually interact with fans and actually do marketing for your book and things like that. But anyway, if you go traditional route, here's what you got to do. You got to find an agent to represent your book to a bunch of publishers. Part of that finding an agent to accept the job role is there may be more revisions that are asked to be done in order to make the manuscript ready to present to publishers, and then the publisher will ask for revisions and may hand it off to an editor or something like that. So there's more editing that happens in the publication phase, but that's just due to the nature of the publication phase. So you'll find an agent. There's a bunch of ways to find agents. I think Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America has like a database of like science fiction and fantasy agents that you can email and ask if they'll take a look at your synopsis and consider reading your book and shopping it around. But that can take a long time, just so you know. So you may get an agent to represent your book, and it may take years before anyone publishes it. I think that happened to Steven Erikson, actually. I think it took like 10 years or something for the first Malazan book to be published. And then a publisher accepts it, they print it, they cut you a royalty check for what they've done, and then they reserve the rights to what you're doing, at least some portion of the rights. So you have to, whenever you want to do something with that IP, you have to be kind of negotiating with your publisher. So there's some ups and some downs to that, to going that direction. The other direction is the independent publishing route, which is where you are going to publish the book yourself on all these platforms. And publishing yourself is going to involve a bunch of different things. You have to take your manuscript and you have to prepare an ebook file. I actually do have a video on how to do that, where to start actually with your Microsoft Word file and then turn it into a appropriate ebook. You have to be able to market the ebook yourself. You have to be able to hire a cover designer to design the cover, or design a cover yourself, which is a financial investment or a time investment. You have to be able to format the paper book yourself or hire somebody to do it. Again, which is another cost than either time or money. And I don't have a video up yet about how to turn your manuscript into a properly formatted paperback PDF for print on demand applications. You have to decide if you're going to print on demand or if you're going to order a bunch of copies, how you're going to sell the copies, what retailers are going to go through. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in that indie publishing phase. But luckily there's a lot of resources out there too to help you figure out and navigate which way you want to go. Do you want to go wide? Do you want to go exclusive with Kindle? Like, what do you want to do? There's a lot of decisions to be made there, and it's a lot of extra work to do kind of the independent route when it comes to marketing the book and designing all the materials and figuring out how to build up an email list and all that kind of stuff. All that comes with time. But the other thing is, if you're going traditional, you may be waiting years to get it published anyway. So there's two good paths to go by, and I usually just go independent because I want to get my books to market quicker. I have connections with you guys that are watching possibly, and they'll, I have people that might want to buy my books already, and I don't necessarily want to wait around for years to see my book published, to have it put in a bookstore that someone may not buy and send it back to the publisher a year later, and maybe never make an advance back if I get an advance, or just be cut a very small check because you only get a small portion of the sales. If you go independent, you get a bigger portion of the sales. That's another plus. So yes, it's more work, but you get to keep all the money. So if you're on that like KDP exclusive track, if you're exclusively with Amazon, and you can actually get paid a 70% royalty when they publish your book, they're the publisher of record, and 70% is a lot. If you're selling like a $2.99 ebook, that's like more than $2 per ebook that you sell, versus if a big five publisher put your ebook up at $2.99, I mean, you get like a couple cents. It's a wildly different thing because they're upfronting all the costs, right? And so they have a bigger financial stake in what's going on. So there's plus and minuses to each one, and you got to decide what path you're going to go by. So anyway, that's your overview. Those are your four phases. Planning, what I consider the most important. Usually, if you fail in planning, that's when you're going to have a failure somewhere else, including sales, right? Because I've written books. I've written at least one book that basically nobody reads. So I didn't write a book that the market wanted. Right, so I didn't think about the market in planning phase, even though the rest of it went easy. It's just not a book. It's not a subject that people are super, super interested in, and that's fine. That's my mistake, but I still enjoyed writing it, and I'm satisfied from it. So I have no regrets about that sort of thing. So planning, execution of the rough draft, revision, and then finally publication. Those are your main phases. So thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I do have a new album coming out, Memories Adrift, David V. Stewart's Zool. Here's the physical copy, which you can get at zoolonline.bandcamp.com. I know that I'm making a video about books and then I'm plugging a CD, but whatever, that's how it is. You can also buy my books. My latest one, which is Water of Awakening, it's right here. Water of Awakening, which is my epic fantasy novel. So check it out if you're into fantasy, please. I think the ebook is still 99 cents for a while, which is good. This one's actually free, Garmish and the Farmer, and this one ties into this one a little bit, so that's fun. And then here's my historical fiction novel, Muramasa Blood Drinker, which you can definitely please check out if you're into feudal Japan. That one was quite a bit of fun. And here's the book that most people don't read, Prophet of the Godseed. This one's also free right now, so you can check it out and read it for free if you want. Zero risk. You guys have a good one, and let me know how your projects are turning out. I sincerely hope that you're doing well with them. Have a great one.